Thank you all for hanging around, for being patient, because this is beyond worth it, I'll tell you. When I got the email a few weeks back asking me to introduce Antonya Nelson here tonight, I have to admit that I experienced kind of a out-of-body elation, that weird kind of unexpected giddiness, embarrassing, adolescent that comes over one when in proximity to celebrity. And I have to admit, too, that I'm still embarrassingly giddy about this, so much so that my initial attempts to write an intro resulted in about 10 pages of single-spaced, breathless fan blather. You know, the kind of comments that begin by quoting text and end up talking about, well, your fabulous shoes. Absolutely out of control. I first encountered Toni Nelson's stories when I was a very beginning writer, working up in Port Townsend all by myself, no Hugo house in sight, trying to figure out how to put a story together and really living off the new fiction shelf at our little Carnegie library. Toni's first collection, The Expendables, won the Flannery O'Connor Award, a really big deal, and so made it to that shelf. And to me, I was enthralled by the voice and the sensibilities. The stories were witty and smart and shocking at times and moving, like nothing really that I'd ever read before in that particular kind of voice. Then came the next collection, In the Land of Men, and I went out and bought this before it made it to the library. And if you knew my finances at the time, that was a pretty big deal too. My copy of that book looks as if I've been trying to translate it. Stories like the title story and the control group are nearly unreadable in my books. They're so inked over. And that was really just the beginning. There's Family Terrorists, Female Trouble, Some Fun, Nothing Right. Man, those are just the story collections. The copies of Nelson books that I own are fully defaced by my scribbles. I know when I'm really engaged in a book, when I start writing on the flyleaves and in the margins, I start writing my own stories. I jot down, dialogue, snatches of scenes inspired perhaps not so much by the subject matter or the voice, but by the mastery on display, the emotional charges, and the questions and admiration they engender. How, for instance, does Toni Nelson write so much about family with ever becoming sentimental or maudlin? This is only 4 single-spaced pages, by the way, not 10. How does she know what veils to lift to reveal the true heart of a long, intimate friendship and then allow it to evolve on the page? How does she walk so fearlessly into the most dire of subjects and emerge with stories that resonate with humor and an unforeseen empathy at the same time? I mean, I hate to do this because I know you've all been waiting, but I have to give this example from an early collection, In the Land of Men. In the title story, a young woman is picked up after a waitress shift by 3 brothers. One of them has been picking her up every night for the past year since the night she'd been attacked or raped, but on this night, all 3 are there, and 2, they soon tell her, her rapist is also there, tied up in the trunk. They found him, they got him, and for most of the duration of the story, they drive around brothers and sister with the man in the trunk. It's a ridiculous but heart-filled situation that ends with these brothers leaving the decision to their sister. They have a gun. Should they kill him? Take him to the police? The situation verges on the comical, except that just at the moments when you start to give in to the humor, the story hits nerves. The brutal crime is remembered. The girl decides she must check to see if the man in the trunk truly is a rapist. Horribly he is. And then there's this new to the reader information placed almost at the story's end. Our mother died 3 years ago. We worried all along about the wrong things. We fretted about her recovery from cancer, chemotherapy, and the fluctuating number of months her doctors had thrown around as her life expectancy. But those things never turned out to be relevant. Some percentage of people slip away under anesthesia. It's a risk of every operation, a posted figure, like car accidents, like crimes. After my mother was gone with only my brothers and my father and me, I thought, here you are in the land of men. I never missed her more. I never felt more outnumbered than when I came home from the police station last year. I told myself growing up meant losing things, but then it didn't feel so much like loss as it did theft. That's what I'm talking about. In the citation for the Ray Award for Short Fiction, which Cynthia Ozek once called our little Nobel, the jurors raved eloquently about Antonya Nelson's work. Let me quote them. In even her earliest short stories, Antonya Nelson's passionate writing was marked by a clear-eyed, unflinching, and ferocious vision. And over the years, her work has only grown stronger and deeper as she focuses in on those aspects of our lives that contain both what is most terrifying and what is most thrilling. Gorgeously written, always surprising, her stories startle us into new ways of thinking about her characters' lives and our own. With Funny Once, her 7th collection of stories, Antonya Nelson has now published 11 books, 7 collections and 4 novels, and won much acclaim in the process. Her stories have been chosen for the Best American Short Stories and O. Henry Prize stories. Her books have been New York Times notable books of 92, 96, 98, and 2000. She's been the recipient of all the best awards, that Flannery O'Connor Award. These are just naming a few, I know. NEA, Grant, Guggenheim Fellowship, and that quite spectacular Ray Award for Short Fiction. She shares the Cullen Chair in Creative Writing at the University of Houston with her husband, writer Robert Boswell, and also teaches in the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers. You know, I've grown up a little bit as a writer since I first read The Expendables. I went and got an MFA, etc. And now I am a heartless, cannibalistic reader of prose. So kind of a hedge fund manager of a reader who more often than not reads for what I can bank about writing in my own accounts. But when it comes to Antonya Nelson's stories and novels, I remain that smitten, heart-open reader I once was, and despite my tendencies, I am entirely won over, charmed and intrigued. My scribbled queries in the books I own now resemble those that one might more readily conjecture about a legendary illusionist. In other words, I'll wonder, I'll ask, but I'm pretty reconciled to the fact that Toni Nelson possesses her own spectacular, inimitable magic. Although just between us, I'm really hoping she'll spill some secrets big time tonight. Oh, lucky audience, thank you for sticking around, and please join me in welcoming Antonya Nelson.
Hi. Thank you for that very overwhelming introduction. Thank you for that. I'm going to talk to you about, I can't see you, which is probably good. You're just a blurry bit of business outside these very bright lights up here. But I'm going to talk to you about some of the things I know in constructing fiction that have to do with archetypes. And I think that seems like a sort of lofty term, and I don't want it to seem like a lofty term because that isn't actually how I teach. But I thought I would start with describing how I might introduce this to a class, a workshop class of writers about what I mean. And I'm going to situate that by saying that my own work, in short stories especially, has been problematic when I don't have a particular plot. I have a situation, I have a bunch of characters, I have what my workshop comrades back in grad school called vignettes, but oftentimes I didn't really have a story per se. And discovering a way to make story out of the material that I knew was worth writing about has been one of the biggest things that I figured out as a writer post-grad school, and it's one of the things I'm most interested in talking about with others. And I decided to collapse that information under this title, Archetypes, to talk with you all. So if you could imagine, first of all, that on a blackboard behind me were 2 words that were stretched on a line, and on one side it said stereotype over here, and on the other side it said archetype. If you could just hold that in your mind's eye for a second. And then in that same kind of continuum, another line underneath that, formula over here where stereotype was. Is that where I put stereotype over here on the right? And form over here on the left where archetype is, that's what I'd like you to sort of keep in mind, those two words that occupy a kind of similar space with something that we think of as being, at least in my world, a negative trait in fiction. One doesn't want to write stereotype and one doesn't want to write formula. Those two things are fairly predictable and cliched, familiar, and their companion parts are not. The idea of an archetype and a form has a kind of elegance and, in the instance of archetype, a kind of universality that you're attempting to make your audience make contact with your characters. So you want to have characters who are familiar to them, and yet you don't want to occupy that space that becomes stereotype. You want to stick with archetype as opposed to stereotype. But they're on the same continuum, which makes it a little problematic. And the same is true with formula and form, where formula is sort of what the genre writers are performing for you, where there's a predictable expectation in the sense of what a mystery is after, or what a romance novel is after, or what anything that has a kind of predictable outcome is after, that there's attention to the plot elements that is overwhelming the elements that are character-driven or realistic. Whereas the form, which is an artistic form, has some integrity that is not really about formula, but they are still on, they share a kind of shapeliness and a kind of sense of where the plot is going. But I do want to sort of set those up as opposites, yet in the same neighborhood as one another. So those are things I just want you to hold in your head, if you can, while I'm talking about the idea of an archetype. A lot of this came about for me when I realized that when people were telling me to write what I knew, which you've probably heard before, to write what you know, a lot of what I know is literature. I know a lot of other things too, but mostly it has to do with, how to clean a sponge, or I don't know, things that are not really that interesting for fiction. But I read a lot. I still read a lot, and at some point I realized that the fiction I was reading, the movies I was seeing, the songs I was responding to, were also informing the way that I was writing into the world. And so when I'm talking about archetypes, some of what I'm talking about is the way that people are retelling the same stories. And whether they are doing that by obvious means, that is to say, overtly mentioning the places and sources they've gotten their work from, or whether they are invisibly doing that same thing, that's what I'm interested in. And that's really what this talk is mostly about the ways that writers borrow from or respond to other writers. And I guess I could start by talking about somebody like Joseph Campbell. I'm going to get some water. Joseph Campbell, you probably are familiar with the hero with 1,000 faces, yes? I really can't see you, but I hope you are. He borrows from Jung's work with the collective unconscious and the sense that there's commonality in the stories that people tell themselves and inform their lives by, in mythology or otherwise. And while I think Jung is really interesting, that's a little too abstract for me, so I sort of liked that Campbell's notion was to line this up in a very prescriptive manner. And then for somebody like, who's his face, the George Lucas, Star Wars, to take that and to make films that we can look at this story of the hero's quest. So, and you've all seen at least one of those. so overtly available to you, where each of the steps in Campbell's hero's quest is played out in Star Wars, also in The Matrix. You don't have to go very far. The last time I taught a class in which we talked about the hero's quest, one of my students who'd been sort of obviously unavailable, i.e. asleep most of the time, upon reading Sherman Alexie's What You Pawn I Will Redeem, under the notion that it was a hero's quest story, suddenly came to life and had a whole narrative about video games and how everything in this certain video game was all about the hero's quest, and he could substantiate it and defend it, and it was his most animate moment in an entire semester and pretty much saved him. At any rate, the notion that there are these characters who've been called to some duty, some quest, some notion of having to go on an adventure. When I teach this in short story form, I teach Eudora Welty's story, The Wide Net, and Sherman Alexie's What You Pawn I Will Redeem. And has to go on an adventure, has to dive into, pretty literally in the Welty story's instance, some sort of larger than his own life experience and bring back from it to his normal life information. It is a shape, and it's also predicated on this mythos that we possess, it seems, universally. That's basically what Campbell discovered in realizing that in every culture around the world, people independent of one another possess this exact same narrative, the hero's quest, which is kind of a great thing to understand, that we have in our heads a feel for what is story and what makes story, this going out and then coming back. That's a fairly large monomyth, and it's not something I would recommend that every student perform, but it's a nice place to start, a sense of there being this larger story. But in fact, dealing with students, you might want to bring yourself down to more local levels. Almost every semester, when I start the semester, I begin with a short story by Michael Cunningham called White Angel. I don't know if any of my former students are here. When I teach that story, we always read it aloud in class, and it's a very stirring, moving story. And their response is similar to my own. When I first read it, I did not understand why it was so moving to me. It's a profoundly moving story. And not just because a young boy dies and his narrating brother is devastated by it, because that could be a bad story too. But in fact, after reading that story a lot of times, a whole lot of times, what I realized is that Cunningham was using a familiar story, a familiar myth, to inform his story, which is the Christ story, the character of this 16-year-old drug-dealing, wide-open, stoned 1970 teenager. Carlton is actually a stand-in for a kind of Christ figure for his younger brother, Bobby, who is his most devoted disciple, and who also feels, by the way, responsible for his death. And so the story becomes then a kind of parable, a retelling of a certain story, but not one that any person I've ever taught the story to has ever recognized before I pointed it out. Once you point it out, it's impossible not to see it. That's the thing that's sort of remarkable to me about this story, and maybe the thing that feels the reason I think that creating a story and deciding or discovering what kind of myth, familiar story it subscribes to comes in revision, I'm fairly certain is what happened with Cunningham, that at some point he realized that the power of his story, the power of the memory that generated the story, had to do with his own unconscious understanding of how significant that story, that Christ story, is to most of us, that it has a kind of resonance that we are going to respond to. I want to reiterate, I think he wrote the story that he wrote, not knowing that he was retelling a familiar story, and that once he recognized he was telling a familiar story, he capitalized upon that in his revisions. I guess if you're not interested in revising, this isn't going to be a very interesting talk to you, because I think that revision is where most of this stuff gets performed. Most of this attention to the notion of having constructed or being in pursuit of something that is new yet universal. That for me is what this is sort of addressing. Cunningham later wrote a book called The Hours, which you might be familiar with, which is also based on somebody else's work, a more conscious and more deliberate exploration of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which gives 3 different sort of iterations of that story. But again, the writer has given himself an architecture on which to build his narratives. And for me, that's one of the things that's really important, being plot impaired as I am, that if somebody else is going to provide for me some sort of structure that I can hang on to and write into, then I've given myself a way of knowing how to pace a story. I highly recommend both the story White Angel by Michael Cunningham and The Hours by him, which is not dependent on your having known Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, but very moving if you do know it. One of the ways I first encountered this idea of there being a kind of continuing retelling of stories is when I was in graduate school. I was reading Ray Carver. That was who was in vogue when I was in grad school. And his story, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, was on everybody's lips, as were a number of other stories. When I was writing about it, I was realizing that what Carver was writing about, or what Carver was responding to, was a trilogy of stories by Anton Chekhov, one of which is called About Love. The other 2 are called Gooseberries and Man in a Case. And if you know the Carver story, there are 4 people sitting around in Albuquerque over a table drinking gin and discussing the meaning of love. In the Chekhov trilogy, it's a trio of men who are tromping around in the wilderness in Russia, defining love by using anecdotes. And once I started to investigate this, what I realized is that Chekhov actually wasn't innovating this either, and probably Plato wasn't either, but Plato's Symposium is also about a group of men hanging around in a bathhouse using anecdotes to illustrate their definition of love. So that if you start with the Plato's Symposium, people defining love by using anecdotal evidence to support their arguments, and then you move forward hundreds of years to Chekhov, locating this not with the philosophers and their fancy baths, but with working class men out in farmland, and then further relocate it 100 or so years later to Ray Carver's Albuquerque, where women get included. The reinvention of this same form of people's sitting with not much to do except exposing their definitions of love by anecdote, it is precisely the same story. And maybe some of you read Nathan Englander's What We Talk About, Where We Talk About Anne Frank, a sort of further, I don't know, another supplement in the line of what that story is up to. Sometimes, rather than emulating or paying tribute, what a writer is doing when he's or she's modeling or responding to somebody else's story is argumentative. And since I was already talking about Chekhov, I thought I would mention that his comrade Tolstoy wrote a story called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I can't see you, but has anyone read that? Chekhov and Tolstoy were friends. They were not enemies by any stretch, but I think Chekhov was really offended by the way The Death of Ivan Ilyich functions, which is a story that's a huge morality play. It's really designed to make the reader think at the end, oh, you must change your life, you got to stop being ambitious, and when you die, you need to not be in the position that this poor character is at the end of his life. Ivan Ilyich is like a mess, and he's mortally wounded by a curtain rod, and it's all about his superficial character, and nobody understands him, and at the very last moment of his life, he touches his little weeping child's head and understands he's lived his life all wrong. And then he dies. And the reader is meant to understand that you must change your life. Well, Chekhov, I think, took issue with this as a way of writing a story. And in response to this story, wrote a half dozen and possibly more stories, including Gusev, The Bishop, and even a boring story, and others, in reaction to Tolstoy, so that it's not, and specifically The Death of Ivan Ilyich, it's not really admiration, but it still is retelling the same story, but in argument in some way, in philosophical disconnection. And his notion was that actually you don't learn anything by being at death's doorstep. And in fact, you can pass away in the bottom of a ship and be tossed overboard, and fish will go after you. This is how Gusev ends. You can be a monumentally famous person and no one understands you, and you can die and your mother can tell your tale and never understand. Any number of ways that Chekhov responded to Tolstoy had to do with telling the same story but refashioning the way that it results as a way of participating in a kind of modeling and response. And I think that too is a way of addressing the notion of an archetype. Here's the tale, here's the character, what will you do in this version of it? It's written in agitation, which is its own kind of emotional position to be in. A story you dislike, maybe a story you need to write your way out of and respond to. Another set of responses sort of in the same category, actually same and different, is the response to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which was the story that Francis Ford Coppola used in order to model Apocalypse Now, the quite amazing film. And he definitely pays tribute to and borrows from that story. That was Orson Welles' notion of the first film he wanted to make. Instead, he made that other one. But anyway, Chinua Achebe, the African writer, had a very different response to Heart of Darkness and decided he would write a novel in reaction against. But on either side, which became Things Fall Apart, Achebe's novel, on either side of this, whether it's the enamored emulation and sort of reinvention of the old story, or whether it's an argument against the old story, in both cases, new art was made from the first art, which I sort of love and appreciate. And for me, I mean, I've taught classes where what I've wanted to show students are short stories. They're the easiest for me to work with, where the original and then the revised or the rewritten, the renewed, the other, are placed next to each other. And these are ones that I have found on my own and have been really happy to locate, and really only circumstantially unlucky. For example, James Joyce's Araby, placed next to John Updike's A and P, are in essence the same story, which for me means that there's a kind of legitimacy to the structure and form, and a kind of pleasure on my part of seeing, Ireland in 1860, I don't even know, next to Pennsylvania, Connecticut in 1950. There's something, the supermarket and the fair next to each other, but with the same human problems and the same desire of the very young adolescent boy character to impress this sort of over and beyond his ability girl. I like the modernization. I like the idea of forcing the contemporary writer to find analogous situations in our world. I think it's an exercise in making sure you understand that human nature doesn't change over time. It's one of the ways I know that Chekhov remains contemporary, is that his stories can be retold if you can figure out the contemporary setting and situation. A writer who does something slightly different, but along the same lines, is Alice Munro, who retells stories. And I've discovered this kind of accidentally over time. But her retelling is more complicated than just making the contemporary analog. What she appears to do is take the elements from various stories and reconfigure them in terms of weight and proportion and narrative power. And I don't even know how to describe this exactly, but to say that her story, Menacee Tongue, feels to me very based in Sherwood Anderson's Death in the Woods, where you have, without knowing these stories, I don't know how meaningful this will be, but the character of a dead woman and her sort of importance in the lives of the characters around her is sort of the centerpiece of the story, and the way that the narrator understands her exclusively becomes the point of the story. But it isn't a kind of piece-by-piece retelling. It's much more abstract than that. And it pays homage in one way, but in another way, it feels to me as if Munro is just borrowing the furniture of these other stories and applying them to her own work. And as she is sort of our most interesting living short story writer, I find that a fascinating situation. Her story, Labor Day Dinner, I coincidentally ended up teaching right after I had taught The Dead by James Joyce and realized that basically it's the same story. But I wouldn't have seen that. I wouldn't have seen it except that they happened to be on the syllabus within 3 days of each other. And most recently, her story Carried Away, which I was teaching, I realized was a retelling of Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Without knowing these stories, I don't think I can make any sense of this to you, except to say that there's something really exciting about discovering how she has toyed with the material, not to make it match up, as others might do in a retelling, but just that she's tossed the elements into some sort of mix and turned them into a story that works. These are sort of deeply hidden. These are deeply hidden archetypal stories. And the ones that I guess I would probably be more likely to talk about with students would not be so deeply hidden. For example, Cynthia Ozick's story, The Shawl, which maybe you know, which appeared in The New Yorker in 1980, was a fairly famous story. In 2001, Louisa Erdrich published a story in The New Yorker called The Shawl also, where she clearly was confronting Cynthia Ozick's story using a lot of the same elements and arguing against that story. It's provocative. It sort of depends on the author's intention and the author's ability to create a work that can stand alone. But if you realize that The Shawl is a very famous story by somebody else, it expands in meaning. It has to stand on its own. I do want to say that. A story that is modeled after another one has to have its own integrity. But if you're aware of the story that it's come from, it has an additional kind of heft and meaning for you. Finally, I thought I would talk a little bit about a story because I want to bring this down to the kind of practical level. I began writing a story which ended up being called Kansas, and it began set in New Mexico, and it began with a notion that two girls, aged 17 and aged 3, would disappear in a car, one to go to high school, dropping off the other at Montessori, and they wouldn't reappear again until Sunday morning. So their disappearance on Friday morning to school and their reappearance on Sunday morning was clear to me. Nothing else was clear to me, and it was set in New Mexico when I started it. And the story was really about the parents of these children. They were cousins, two sets of parents, each set a little bit not that good at being parents, but related to each other and living in a kind of compound with one another. And I wrote it, and there wasn't sufficient tension in it, and I realized that the girl's disappearance needed to have some weather elements thrown in because there's just no weather in New Mexico, and I couldn't make the anxiety amp up enough. So I relocated it to Kansas because there is a possibility of storms and tornadoes, and so that was helpful. And then at some point I realized because the characters had been sitting around in the middle of the night, drunk, doing silly drunken things, one of which was the brother-in-law, the ne'er-do-well brother-in-law, giving imitations of all the characters from Wizard of Oz as if they were stopped for DUI, doing their business. I invoked the Wizard of Oz, and so the story suddenly had a lot of elements having to do with the Wizard of Oz, and I renamed the aunt and uncle of the little girl Emily and Henry, and threw in some monkeys and green. I mean, it actually got a little overt, I thought. But once I had started revising with the notion of shaping it around the Wizard of Oz, the story gained a kind of authority to me, the teller, not necessarily the reader. I don't think any reader of the story would actually recognize that it's shaped by the Wizard of Oz. In fact, down to the characters having this series of shared cell phones and pictures taken on the cell phones that in the end are going to be reproduced of them opening a storm cellar in Medicine Lodge, Kansas, and putting it in black and white. I think it might be the last line of the story. It's, to me, an incredibly obvious connection to the Wizard of Oz, and I think to not just the casual reader, any reader, invisible, absolutely invisible. But what I would like to say, I guess what I would like to emphatically say, is that if your story is based on some other story, it's not just that that archetype has inherent power over the reader, it's that it has power over the writer, and that when you are writing it with a notion that you are retelling something or re-envisioning or revisiting or whatever, that you possess a sort of authority that conveys itself in your enthusiasm for it, in your confidence in it, even if the reader doesn't recognize it on a first or second or third or even 10th read, that its power exists there nevertheless. And that for me is hugely helpful. So I was going to talk about the characters on Gilligan's Island, but as related to the characters on Mad Men, but I decided I shouldn't do that because that's referenced in some episode of Mad Men about how everything is about Gilligan's Island and that you can start sort of assigning these stereotypical roles, but that once you start envisioning, not the skipper, but Bert Cooper, and not, Ginger, but Joni, they all become sort of differently inflected, but they kind of subscribe to a certain sort of archetypal. But then I decided I'm just, lost in Mad Men, and I should stop that. So I'm going to close with the notion of archetypal stuff there, and I hope you'll ask questions, because sometimes I feel like I'm not entirely clear. Anyway, that's what I have on that topic.
So first, I really love this talk, partly because one of the things that consumed me when I read the new book, Funny Once, great book, it's best ever, was a story called Winter in Yalta. And when I first read Winter in Yalta, I really enjoyed the story. And I'm going to get my technical question here. But I thought there's something here that I'm not, there's something else here that's resonating with me. And there's the title, of course, but I'll put that aside for a second. And I thought of a story by William Trevor called Virgins. I don't know how conscious this is with you or whether it came into revision. But Michael, the third slide, maybe? Is that there? Nope, next one. Yeah. Virgins, do you remember this story? Okay, wow, this is amazing then. This is like discovering gold. So Virgins is a story by William Trevor. It's a gorgeous story. It's about two teenagers who are best friends, the English Laura and her Irish friend Margarita, and they spend the summers together in Margarita's house in Ireland. And there's a love triangle. There's this sickly young man, Ralph de Courcy, that they are both infatuated with. And he plays them. He writes to each one of them in secret, and ultimately it destroys their friendship as children, and they meet much later on in life, and they still can't reconcile. Winter in Yalta in Lucky Once is about two friends who meet at college, two women, and there's a love triangle involved in there too, and a secret, but they manage to keep their friendship through life, and it's a sustaining thing for them, this friendship. Until towards the end of the story, a secret comes out that one of the women has still been seeing this man as friends, but still been seeing this man. After all these years, there's still that connection, this thing between them, this wedge between them. So I went back to William Trevor's Virgins, and I looked at the end of the stories. And the first excerpt here is from Virgins, and it says, "Again, Laura tried to say that she, as much as Margareta, had been shamed. Sharing their folly, would they have laughed in the end over Ralph de Courcy, she wondered, as they had laughed over so much else? Would they have talked for half the night in Margarita's bedroom, exercising that lingering pain? Margareta, Laura began, but still could not go on." That's how Virgins kind of ends. Winter in Yalta, this is not the very end, but it's very close to the end. They fell asleep in mid-drunk conversation, just the way they had in the city more than 30 years before, in twin beds then instead of queens, in a small room without air conditioning, under a breeze from an oscillating fan. Into the dark they had spoken, filling each other in on everything that mattered and much that didn't. The friendship is allowed to evolve in Winter in Yalta, and it seemed to me that you took that story and asked a question, what would happen if the friendship could continue? So I immediately saw an antecedent in that story with William Trevor, and then in the next slide, Michael, the title, Winter in Yalta. If you're a literary writer, what do you think of right away? You think of Chekhov's Lady with a Pet Dog, Yalta, Gorov and Anna, and this love affair that they don't know what to do with. Like, where do you go from here? And so we get this at the end of Lady with a Pet Dog. And it seemed as though in a little while the solution would be found, and then a new and splendid life would begin. And it was clear to both of them that they still had a long, long road before them, and that the most complicated and difficult part of it was only just beginning. This is the very end of Tony Nelson's Winter in Yalta. A strangely vital thing, love, a very invisible yet essential item, hidden as an illness, mortal that way as well. In her bed, listening finally to Rochelle's steady sleep nearby, Kara felt sure an answer would come to her regarding their friendship. It was not over, but where would it go? Where could it go next? And whom could she tell now how she now felt? Nobody, nobody. Outside, the air was growing brisk, a last blast of winter. On Sunday, after they boarded their flights apart and home, they would each pass through those enduring clouds, that ongoing cold rain. Now, I don't know if you meant to use either of these, but I saw them there, and it enlarged the story even more for me. I appreciated the story as it was, but your lecture this is like my example right here. Did you mean for any of that?
I wasn't thinking about Trevor, but I was thinking about both the dead and Lady with a Pet Dog, because one of the characters is a big reader, and so there's conversation. Not the point of view character, but Rochelle is a big reader, so she's always going to visit literary sites and sort of makes references, which is fun for me to do, that the protagonist, Kara, does not understand, like why you'd go. And she says something about, I think, Ireland and Joyce, and the character says, Joyce who, and she says, who Joyce. But anyway, it was sort of fun to me to have a character who could be involved in literature where the protagonist had no clue what she was on about, but the story's shape is not from Trevor. I actually don't remember Virgins, but both the dead and Lady with a Pet Dog kind of playing with the idea of there being a place you land where you can't quite imagine where you're going to go next. That ending of Lady with a Pet Dog, I think, is one of the most powerful places to find yourself at the end of a story, and it feels maybe the most authentic in life also, that there doesn't seem to be a solution. Whether you could imagine a solution in the contemporary moment to a love affair in which someone was married and someone, that's different from the way it was 120 years ago in Russia, but the notion that you find yourself in a place where you cannot imagine what can solve the problem you're in, I felt like that could be the place that a friendship could resolve, that doesn't have a clear next step.
Oh, it's perfect. It was such a nice echo. It felt like you were. The most exciting thing for me was that you were continuing a conversation, almost like the stories were talking to each other and enlarging each other. Not just this story being enlarged by those two stories, the one you didn't mean and the one that you did, but Chekhov's story as well. And looking back at Trevor's, I found it really exciting. And I will say this. I had read the collection, and that title was still nagging me, as was the Virgins thing, and so I went back and read those, and then I read the story again, and it was just even larger. I mean, just exactly what you were talking about. It's a wonderful, interesting approach to stories, and finding that pattern.
There are times, I think, when I found that. There was a novel published by Jane Smiley maybe a decade ago called 1,000 Acres that's based on King Lear, and I felt like the publisher felt anxious that the reading public wouldn't understand that the story could stand alone on its own, and so had to acknowledge its sources in the blurbage around it, that it had to be, they had to make sure that the reader understood this was a retelling of Shakespeare's Lear. And I thought that was unfortunate, that they wouldn't allow this book to sort of emerge and be its own thing. And if the reader understood it was a retelling, fine, but if the reader didn't understand, it would be fine also. There's sort of a lack of confidence, I think, on the part of the publisher that this retelling, unless you prefaced the whole situation by saying, this is a retelling of Lear, and therefore you can't question the poisoned sausage or whatever it was. Whatever plot element would have seemed curious or confusing or unbelievable was sort of accounted for by its being a retelling of something. I guess I do want to say I think that's a problem, that if you announce right away, this is a retelling of whatever, and therefore you have to buy into it because it's literature with a capital L, That might be an issue, you know.
Did you want to point readers towards Chekhov, though, with that title?
I don't know. I mean, I actually wasn't thinking about my own story. I don't know whether that works or not, with or without. I mean, I hope it works, minus knowing it.
Yeah.
But if I find myself involved in somebody's story that doesn't seem to me an adept if it's announcing itself too prominently, I'm going to be suspicious somehow of its integrity separate from its origins. And I feel like something ought to be substantial without knowing. It can only be broadened and enlarged by knowing the background. It doesn't lean on or depend on that background. That would be, I guess, the downside or the weakness, is depending too heavily on the model.
Right. You know, you talked about story archetypes, but I also wanted to ask you about character archetypes. I'm sure you get this question over and over again because you write about family a lot and home. And you have a cast of characters they're not types, though. I mean, this is the tricky thing that you do. This is where I want some magic, Tony. So, like Alice Munro, we always recognize an Alice Munro character, right? Or anybody that we read. If we're reading Murakami, whoever, we recognize that that's their character. And in your books, you know, I recognize the gentle boy, the philandering older husband, the wayward sister, and all this, and yet they don't. You can put them in one story after another. They never read predictably. They're recognizable as kin, but they're never boring or familiar. How do you do that? No, I mean, I think it's something about this, you know, you're asking a question. I think that you throw these characters in and say, what would the older philandering husband do, or what would the wife do with this guy in this situation? Or if he'd left, or, you know, whatever. I think there's some question involved, but I don't know exactly what it is.
What is my answer to that? Well, I was looking at, I looked up archetypes online just to see what the expectation might be over such a title, and there are types, it turns out, 12. And what occurred to me is that if you applied those types that were listed in the internet search I did, if you applied those to kind of unlikely people, and maybe 2 or 3 of the characteristics in combination, you would start having a compelling character who was not burdened by only one of those qualities, but by 2 or 3 of them. That is, the martyr who's also really vain, who's also, you know, the head of the lit section of your English department. And so, you know, like the figure who wants to be a mother but is in the wrong place to be a mother. That, I mean, I had a lit colleague who really reminded me of my corgi dog, and I adore my corgi dog, but that set of qualities in my colleague was the most irritating set of qualities ever. She just like constantly at you and always watching, and had really muscular, kind of small legs. And I really just wanted to tell her to kennel up. I think maybe just the distribution of qualities in a way that sort of torques the material is what I'm usually interested in, because my experience with both family and friends is that they're such odd combinations of characteristics that capturing them and dividing their qualities and redistributing them so that I can investigate them in extremis and also without injuring anybody. It's inhibiting to me to write about people autobiographically, except for myself. I don't mind exposing myself, but I'm not very willing to put anybody else I love at risk for being exposed. I don't write with the notion of revenge. So putting qualities from one place onto another, those compilation characters is mostly what I'm doing. That said, the gentle boy is a character I recognize and really feel a kind of fine-tuned affinity for. The boy who's, I think that's a really hard position to be in, to be a boy who's sensitive and whose inclinations are gentle and who's been raised probably, it's hard to be a gentle boy. Easier now maybe than it was, but I've grown up with a lot of those guys, and I feel real compassion for their difficulties. I think it's harder in some ways than being just, a bossy girl, to be a gentle boy.
You also let these characters, I say evolve on the page, and age at different times too, and that sort of brings me to another kind of archetype. I've been rereading some Dickens lately, Our Mutual Friend, which opens with a scene at a dinner party with a nouveau riche couple named the Veneerings. And the names just kind of go on from there. And then I went back to your stories, and as I did, I realized, oh, here you go. You do this. You give your character, I didn't think you could do this anymore, and you do. Like the philandering older husband is called Dr. Shock, or the family is like the Maybe family and the Link family. But in this, this has my favorite family of all, the Panics. And one of the main characters, Hugh, H-U-G-H, Hugh Panic, who I adore. I'm half in love with Hugh Panic. But you managed to use that. That's an old kind of fashion trope. How do you think, am I going to get away with this? I mean, it's wonderful because one of the things it does is, like Panic's situation is tragic. There's a lot of things going on. And Hugh's kind of a sad sack. And yet, at the same time, because the comedy seems to be sort of ingrained in the story, his tragedy doesn't feel like applied. Like you haven't taken a nice character and thrown him into a tough situation where the reader feels kind of hurt at the same time. There's the comedic line, and then the tragedy is like woven through it. So it feels like part of life rather than applied. Which is really, really exciting to watch as a character develops on the page. But do you play around with names a lot, trying to get the comedy in there, or is this just part of your sensibility?
Well, I like unusual names. I like funny names. I take note of them when I find them. One of my best friends when I was younger was called Emily Stubbs, and I always loved that last name, Stubbs. And one of my former grad students, several actually, my grad students, their last name was Moody, which I think is sort of a great last name. So I kind of pay attention. I'm in therapy at present next to a place that's called Burden's Vacuum, and Burden is the last name of the family that owns the vacuum store. So for me, that's kind of interesting. And also it's just a way of...
I love that you're in therapy next to it. I mean, it's just so, that's another one of those examples right there. You've got Burden's Vacuum.
Burden's Vacuum right out the window. And I think I guess it's more common than not that you've got some friend of yours who's got the weird name. My husband has I don't know, we sit around talking about the people who've got these weird names. Like he's got a friend called Lily Dick. I don't know, I think... I know it seems odd in fiction to have these names, but on the other hand, it seems like life itself is often throwing you these weird, funny names. And I think there's something about capturing a little of that to accessorize what you want to seem like realistic fiction, but also that has its own kind of stylistic parameters, which are maybe more free-floating than they were in Dickens' time. I know Dickens would have been much more, he wouldn't have been ironic with the names. The names would have been exactly describing the characters they were describing. But I feel like now it's sort of random luck you would get a name that didn't quite describe you or did exactly describe you.
Yeah, I don't feel like you're always ironic about those names.
No.
And sometimes they lull the reader a little bit. They're a little bit of misdirection because you think, oh, this is funny or whatever. It's like that example I read from In the Land of Men. You think you're in a funny situation almost before you realize that you've got, just our hearts in pieces. So I think it's a really interesting thing to do. I've
Well, I
never,
find myself in that situation all the time. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I was in Tucson in the ER with my friend, and, a man came in all bloody who only wanted change.
She's laughing.
Yeah, it was hilarious, though. It was hilarious. He came in all bloody, and he just wanted change, and then when he saw the sign that said, "No narcotics on premises," he was just like, never mind, and just went out back out the door. I just thought it was great. Like, he wasn't even going to waste his spiel if there were no narcotics on the premises. Anyway.
well, because this has gone a little later,
And
I
it's
do
still
want to
busy.
give people a chance. Is there any way to change the lighting so we can
It's
see
really
people
weird.
out there? Yay, thank you. There are people out there. So maybe to give anyone who has a chance, to give a chance to anyone who has a question for Antonya. Yeah.
I have a question. In your presentation, you said earlier that human nature doesn't change. I don't feel that that's correct. I think it does change. I think written word doesn't change. And written word allows the possibility for interpretation. But I certainly think that human nature does change over time.
I guess what I meant, and I don't know if this is what you mean, but I guess what I mean is that when I read Chekhov, and he has this quality in his stories, not of, I think the reaction Chekhov had against the Tolstoy story was that what Tolstoy was writing was a sort of, this is the way one should or should not behave, a sort of moral lesson. This is, you should change your life because if you behave as this man behaves, you're going to end as he ends, which is to say, regretting the decisions you've made in your life, the shallowness, blah, blah. Chekhov seemed to me to be more interested in describing human behavior rather than moralizing, so that the description of the behavior is what presents itself on the page. And the description, despite being now 140, 30, 20 years difference, an entirely different continent, feels very familiar to me because he doesn't adjust for the sort of moral qualities. So I think people can change, individuals can change, but I think that what we're confronted with as our issues are not particularly different. So I don't know if that's what you mean, but I mean that Chekhov's stories, to me, feel familiar and fresh and contemporary because he's describing the human condition as he witnessed it. And to me, the human condition feels quite similar, even if I've had to adjust for language, technology, etc. So I do think people can change. I just think what Chekhov was writing about is precisely the same kind of things that I'm writing about, more or less. I don't know if that's what I communicated earlier or not, but that's what I meant.
Any other questions? Yeah.
You talked earlier about how in the story of White Angel, you probably didn't realize the archetype component was revising. So my question is, once you realize that in revision, how do you keep yourself from laying it on too thick and getting that balance?
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good question. In fact, the story I was describing of mine, which ended up being called Kansas, but which features all this stuff from The Wizard of Oz, I was in debate with the editor at The New Yorker. I was like, could we call it A Good Witch? Like, I just wanted to go all over the place with it. And she's like, no. So I think at some point you have to be reined in by somebody. But I swear, if you look at that Michael Cunningham story, once you sort of have the key to figuring out how that is constructed, it seems so obvious. I mean, I guess the thing is that a reader only reads a story once. And so whatever it is that's lurking there, it can be fairly overt because the reader isn't going to be studying it unless the reader is a writer or, a lit person or whatever. you're only going to read it once, and its effect needs to be communicated to you. So some of its moves need to be a little more obvious than you might think is tolerable. I mean, that's a weird thing, but I think it's true that you can assume that a reader's only going to read it once and be affected by it, and yet its power is going to be invisible. And if they investigate it and reread it several times, they might locate the source of power. But it still has to be blatant enough for it to have some effect on a first read. And I don't know how to tell you how to do that, just that if you read White Angel once, you aren't going to see it. But if you read it 10 times, you're going to see it. And that's, to me, the weird space. I had a student who'd written this story, and I read it, and I thought it was a good story, and I understood why she liked it as a story. And at some point, I realized the story itself was really a retelling of Peter Pan. I mean, it wasn't working out quite right, but once I told her what I thought its myth was, what its archetypal origins could be, she went back and sort of placed that stuff more emphatically. And the story worked because she had more confidence in it, and also because she knew where to end it. Like before that, it hadn't had a proper ending. The Wendy character hadn't properly grown up and sort of forsaken the Peter guy or whatever. But once she had that model in mind, after having written the story minus the model, it filled itself out in some way. And I think she named that guy Peter, too. But I don't think anybody casually reading it would recognize that. It's just that it gave her confidence. And it has a substance beyond just what's immediately available.
Well, you're talking more about a model than a template, right? I mean,
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, all right. Just to make that clear.
I guess I have a question. I wonder if you ever, nowadays, in the last, 10 years of writing, do you ever write a story and not find a model, not find an archetype, and find you don't actually need one, you're satisfied with the story?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not every
always
story,
the case,
not by a long shot. But if there's a story I love, and if there's some premise that I feel like in my own life could be served by retelling that story, I'm really excited by that. And that's been a relatively new development. It's just that when you write short stories mostly, you could run out of material, like you could be in danger of repeating yourself or just being bored by your own material. And if you think about there being all these stories that you adore or don't adore and want to argue against, then you've got a new arena or a new sort of set of issues. And so much of my time is spent reading as opposed to living. That it's been helpful to me to think of that as being the place where I could locate material. Yeah?
So you were saying before, as far as kind of playing with how subtle you need to be, so you're not too overt, but you still kind of want to clue in your readers. Do you kind of play with that level of subtlety sometimes? Like, do you write for yourself, and then sometimes write for your readers? You know what I mean? Like, sometimes very subtle, and then sometimes I guess kind of determine almost how popular something's going to be depending on how subtle it is,
Well, I'm always really, I'm really happy to discover when I can figure out, that Eudora, I don't know about my own writing, but that Eudora Welty story, The Wide Net, which I love, is so closely allied to Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's quest. And I'm pretty sure that Eudora Welty didn't know that. And that, for me, is kind of the greatest gift, that she's adhering to it without knowing she's adhering to it, so that it kind of goes back to Jung. There's this thing underneath that we're not even aware of that will pop up despite yourself. You will have these instincts to make story out of certain mythos that you couldn't identify. You just have them. You're in possession of them. So I'm about 100% sure she didn't know what she was doing, and it's fairly great, it's fairly consistent, and it's performative in the best sort of way of exactly what Joseph Campbell was talking about. And that, to me, is kind of the ideal. She did it utterly unconsciously, and yet completely perfectly. I don't know about my own stuff. I don't think about that so much in the generative stages. I mean, I guess I don't want to fall into that category of formula where it becomes so predictable that it's, then no longer interesting. It falls from some sort of form into formula, which then becomes genre and thereby less interesting and more recognizable. It needs to be a little excitingly off kilter somehow.
That recognition seems to be pretty key. You were talking about Alice Munro stories. And, her story, Dance of the Happy Shades, was really just a retelling of Welty's June recital. But it's more blatant. It's more like, here's the piano teacher, here's the whole story all over again. And yet what you're talking about really does move it into a whole new territory. It's like that unconscious conversation.
50 years apart from each other, too.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, yeah, but...
I think maybe her work has metamorphosed also over time.
Right.
That she's gotten less direct in the analogs.
Alice Munro?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But what's most exciting about what you're talking about to me is it seems like there's this conversation that happens from these received stories, kind of like one, without even knowing it. Without even knowing it, that there's this conversation going from one story to the next, from one writer to the next, from all of us as readers in this unconscious mode, which just forces away anything to do with formula or template and puts it into that conversation. Any other questions?
When did you decide that you were a writer?
I think probably when I had to go to grad school. I was graduating from college with an English degree, and the GRE was being off. I just don't know. It was like senior year in undergraduate school, and the GRE was going on the next day, and I had to figure out what I was going to do next. It didn't seem like I had anything to do, so I went to an MFA program and kind of threw myself in. I could say something sort of lame, like I was always writing, which is true, I was, but I don't really think I thought of myself as being committed to it so much until I went to grad school in it. And even then, it was a little paddling around. I don't know. Up until maybe 10 years ago, I would never have identified myself as a writer first. It would have been a teacher or something else.
That was after what, the 7th or 8th book? Or?
I just well, it just feels kind of silly because the next question the person on the airplane asks you is, would I have read anything you wrote? And the answer is always no. Always no. Always. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you.
I still want